even at noon. As the Virginian winter dragged on, the days grew shorter and colder. By January, the mercury in Daniel Trabu's new cabin was often below zero. He huddled by the hearth, watching wisps of smoke escape through the cracks in his roof. It was the first winter in his new home, and already he was counting the ways his cabin leaked heat. There were gaps around the windows, a hole in the chimney, and the floor was littered with straw that didn't stop the chill from seeping up his boots. And now his water bucket was frozen solid. Each trip outside was fraught with danger. Daniel pulled his wool cap low, shielding his face from the merciless wind. What if the ice-jammed river made the journey back to the farm impossible? Then they'd have no way to get their animals across, and the entire herd might freeze to death. If his family couldn't make it, well, Daniel refused to think about that possibility. Instead, he gathered up his musket, a coil of rope, and some sharp rocks, and headed out into the storm. For thousands of years, humans have used the power of fire to fend off cold, darkness, and wild animals. But what happens when the temperature dips far below freezing and the materials you would normally use to start that fire are frozen solid? How did people survive such bitter cold? Sometimes ingenuity is born of necessity. In the case of the frontiersmen, women and children who settled the American West, necessity arrived in the form of an ice-jammed river and a frozen supply of firewood. After securing his cabin against the wind and closing off the chimney to keep the warm air inside, Daniel was ready to tackle his frozen bucket. First, he filled a tin cup with water from the spout. This would become his fire piston's primer, a little bit of liquid to introduce oxygen into the mix. Next, he tied a piece of rag to the end of the rope and jammed it into the cracks of his chimney to serve as a makeshift bellows. Then he placed a small rock in the bottom of the cup, a larger rock in the top, and then began rapidly compressing the air by pushing down on the smaller rock. As the air in the cup heated, it burned the rag like a bellows. Hot coals rained down the chimney and into the metal stovepipe. Scrambling quickly, Daniel shoved the bucket into place over the stovepipe. Warm air gushed into the bucket, melting the ice and providing his family with water for another day. But how do you keep warm enough to function when you can't cook or boil water? Many early American settlers relied on soups, stews, and porridge that could be prepared over a fire without boiling. Foods like these could sit for hours over a low flame without overheating. Settlers also learned to cook under layers of ash. A Dutch oven is one example of this method. With this thick-walled ceramic pot, settlers could cook hearty meals of stew meat, cornbread, and baked apples without having to tend the fire at all. As the night wore on, Daniel felt a sudden gust of wind rattle the logs of his cabin. It was so loud, in fact, that he could hardly hear the crackle of the fire. Settlers along the frontier knew that if they didn't take steps to secure their cabins against the wind, the elements would simply waltz right in. They anchored heavy furniture to the walls, closed off fireplaces, set up extra barricades of earth and stone against the doors, and covered any gaps with blankets and quilts. All of these methods helped seal off the living space from frigid temperatures. But sometimes the wind managed to squeeze through the tiniest of cracks, and that's when things got really creative. In order to protect their homes and families from the wind, settlers sometimes resorted to hanging sheets and blankets over doorways, piling furniture against walls and anchoring heavy boxes to the floor. One resourceful woman even recalled using her husband's buckskin hunting clothes as padding to stuff into cracks in their cabin walls. These tactics not only kept the wind out, but also trapped precious heat inside the cabin. Because every degree counted, people found ways to huddle together for warmth. Families slept in the same bed or huddled together on the floor, surrounded by their children and pets. They shared body heat with anyone who would snuggle close, turning the fight for warmth into a community effort. Daniel crawled into bed next to his wife, pulling the covers over his head. Outside, the wind continued its relentless assault on the cabin, but inside, nestled among his loved ones, Daniel felt a surge of hope. Would this winter be the worst one yet? Only time would tell. Winter on the frontier was a battle waged in silence, solitude, and darkness. When the sun dipped below the horizon before the chilling noon hour, Settlers had to contend with long periods of darkness, punctuated only by the flicker of a hearth fire. To cope, many turned to storytelling and games, creating a sense of camaraderie and warmth, even as the temperatures dropped. And when the howling winds finally died down and the sun returned, Daniel stepped outside to discover something remarkable. A gentle breeze rustled through the trees, and the sky blazed with the vibrant colors of a winter sunrise. They say that no two winters are alike, but some come close. The one that just ended was a lot like the one before it, and the one before that, and the one before that. But every now and then comes a winter like the one we had back in 1885. It has been called the worst winter in history, or at least in the history of the place we now call North Dakota. But let me tell you about it. It was a hard winter to be alive, harder still to be awake. Picture this. It's 1885 in the Dakota Territory. The year before, more than 100,000 settlers had poured into the Dakotas, hoping to make their fortunes off the land. They built towns that looked a lot like the ones they'd left back east, with boardwalks and saloons and general stores. Now, those same towns were buried under snow, and the only sounds louder than the wind were the screams of the damned as they tried to dig themselves out. Now, my great-grandmother didn't know what the temperature was outside, didn't have a thermometer, but she knew when her eyelashes froze together, because they always froze together when it hit about 40 degrees below. When it got that cold, she couldn't even cry. The tears would freeze on her face before they hit her cheeks. Even breathing hurt. Every time she inhaled, it felt like shards of glass were slashing her throat. She described it like this. The air was so cold that when you breathed, the moisture from your lungs would immediately freeze in your throat and down your windpipe like an icicle. Her nose was always clogged with ice, too. She'd wake up with it so bad that her whole head would feel like it was splitting open. But even those diaries can't really convey how dark it was. Because in a place like this, darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence all its own. In the hard winter of 1885, the sun only shone for an hour a day. Just a sliver of light that peeked over the horizon before sinking right back down again. So people lived by the light of candles and fireplaces, huddled inside their homes, trying not to breathe too hard or shed too many tears. And you'd think that would have been enough, but it wasn't. You see, most of us have the luxury of turning up our thermostats when it gets cold, but they didn't. They couldn't. Their homes weren't insulated. There was no such thing as indoor plumbing. And if you wanted a fire, you had to build one yourself. My great-grandmother would spend all day gathering wood, and still the fires would go out in the night, leaving them in total darkness with nothing but the frozen wasteland outside their windows. Now, I know that doesn't sound fun, but I'm being honest. This was their life, and in a way, they liked it. They liked it the same way people today enjoy a good ghost story or a haunted house, because there's a thrill in knowing that something might jump out at you in the darkness. They knew that if they didn't keep a fire going, the next morning they might find their pipes frozen solid, their livestock dead, and their crops buried under a thick sheet of ice. So keeping warm wasn't just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival, and there was no in-between. One minute you'd be cozy by the fire, and the next you'd be fighting to get your heart to beat again. If any one of them had been alone when that happened, they wouldn't have survived. But luckily, they never were. Back then, families slept together, sometimes with the chickens and the dog. Everyone piled together on the same bed to generate body heat. At least they had each other. They had the people they loved most in the world, all crammed together in the dark, trying not to fall asleep while the wind screamed outside. My great-grandmother never wrote down exactly how long the hard winter of 1885 lasted, but she did write this. We were snowbound for months and did not see a human being or hear a sound except the howling of the wind. I often wondered if we would live through the winter. Well, they did, and spring eventually arrived, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings. But for those few months every year that it was cold, well, the darkness stayed just the same. Alright, now that that's done, let's move on to our next story. You feel a tap on your shoulder and turn to see your sister grinning. Come on, she says, grabbing your hand. "Let's go sledding." Before you can answer, she's tugging you toward the door. Outside, the wind is a hungry wolf, gnawing at anything that sticks out. Your nose, your ears, your fingers. You pull your coat tighter and huddle close to your sister. She doesn't seem to notice the cold. Her eyes are shining with excitement. She takes off down the hill, whooping with delight. You want to join her, but your feet seem frozen to the spot. Then you remember what your mother said. If you stop moving, you must keep going. So you take a deep breath and start down the hill after her. When you were little, your mother used to take you sledding on a big old wooden sled like this one. This was before your father died and your family moved on to the prairie. When you were little, there was always enough wood for the fire, enough food for everyone. And in the summers, evenings were filled with the drone of your father's locust, the swish of your mother's broom, as she made brooms from the dried stalks. Your father would always tell you stories about the East, about cobblestone streets and horse-drawn carriages. He told you about ice rinks where people glided around on blades, never touching the cold ground. One day, he promised, we'll have one of those ice rinks. But then the locust came and ate everything in sight. And when your father died, your mother had to sell everything, including the sled. Now, all you have are the memories of your father and the whisper of the wind through the dead stalks of the prairie. The wind is colder than it was when you were little. Now, sometimes in the middle of the night, the wind will rise and howl like a banshee. You wake up shivering, convinced it's trying to tear the house apart. Every morning you wake up hoping the sky will be clear, the sun strong. But the sun never seems strong enough to melt the frost on the window pane or the bucket outside. Your sister fills your mind with stories of the East, of ice rinks and warm rooms. Sometimes she brings home flyers advertising traveling carnivals. They come with pictures of men on ice skates and women in fur coats. You look at the dates they list and do the math. One day in February, 2 years after your father died, you and your sister will be 10 and 12. You're almost grown up, and your mother won't have to worry about you anymore. You can hear her voice now. "Don't be scared," she said last night after another failed attempt to get water. "The bucket's frozen again. You and your sister better get some sleep. It's another long day tomorrow. Another long day in which you will need to keep moving. You're not sure how long you spend sledding, but eventually your sister wants to go home. As you walk back, she skips ahead, but you stay on the path, careful not to waste energy. The wind bites at your face, and you pull your coat tighter. Suddenly, you hear your sister cry out. You turn and see her lying on the ground, her eyes squeezed shut, her face red. "Come on," you say, reaching for her hand. "We have to get home." You help her up, and she limps along beside you. You don't want to admit it, but you're scared. Not only because of the cold or the wind or even the darkness that's beginning to fall, but because of the silence. The silence of the plains, the silence of the dead stalks, the silence of your sister. She stops walking and you turn to her in alarm. "What's wrong?" you ask, but she just keeps staring at the ground. And when she finally looks up at you, you see something in her eyes that you've seen before. It's the look of someone who's given up. From the dark floor nearby, your sister whispers, "Ma, the bucket's frozen again." And your mother answers, "Quiet now. We'll deal with it at first light." In your mind, you know daylight won't thaw that bucket. But you keep silent, because even wasted breath feels like wasted heat. Out here, everything was a threat. The air could kill you. The short walk between buildings could kill you. Even your own sweat could kill you if it froze against your body. And every winter, hundreds did die. Take the Children's Blizzard of January 1888. A young Nebraska teacher named Minnie Freeman found herself in a one-room schoolhouse when the storm struck. In a matter of hours, the temperature dropped 40 degrees. The roof blew off, and blinding snow erased the world. She tied her students together with rope and led them out, saving most of them. Newspapers called her the fearless maid. Across the plains, though over 200 others weren't so lucky, many of them children trying to walk home from school. On February 18, 1888, a Sunday school teacher named Peter Mills woke up in his farm outside Chicago. He felt fine, so he got up, fed his animals, threw threw some brush onto his stove, and headed out to work on his fence line. But something was wrong. That day, Mills suffered a seizure, fell down dead of a heart attack. And he wasn't alone. Now you might wonder, why were they unprepared? The answer is cruel. That morning had been so mild people left home without coats. By noon, the sky turned black, winds roared like a train, and snow came sideways. A Norwegian teen, Carl, salty, recalled being caught out in the open. I fell to the ground, sure I would die. And indeed, more than 200 people died that weekend. In the end, it wasn't the temperature that killed them, it was the winds. The same winds that had lured people outside by feeling warm, but actually carried temperatures of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. They were victims of a phenomenon known as a blizzard inversion. But before the blizzards came, families had to prepare. And preparation wasn't a suggestion, it was life itself. With no grocery stores, no Amazon deliveries, no rushing to Walmart, everything depended on what you had put away before the first frost. So every autumn, households across the Great Plains would shift into emergency mode. Children as young as 4 or 5 years old gathered fuel. Women sealed cracks in walls with mud and made sure roofs were tight. Men stored crops and butchered meat for the winter. It was a full-time job just trying to stay alive. From sunrise to sundown we worked. Remembered one Nebraska boy whose father chopped wood nearly non-stop from August through March. His mother's eyes, he said, carried a silent fear all through autumn as she counted supplies against the long, merciless months ahead. There was so much to watch out for. Spring flooding could ruin food stores. Rodents could overrun granaries. Drafts could freeze pipes and burst walls. People did their best to stay vigilant. They hung meat from beams to keep critters away. They banked fires against cellar walls to warm their own homes and dry their own food. If your cabin held together, if your food supply lasted, if your fire burned through the night, you had a chance at surviving the winter. The hardest thing to come by was fuel. Trees were rare across the prairies, so settlers burned what they could find. Anything that would catch flame. Buffalo chips, cow chips, twisted grass, corn cobs. You can imagine what those were. No one really knows. There's no historical record. We know what they are. They're dried dung. These days, it's hard to find human waste in the woods. Back then, it was everywhere. Setters collected them from riverbanks and prairies. They traded them with neighbors who collected different kinds. Families with cattle hands would pile chips high beside their cabins. When the weather turned, everyone would head out to collect them. Families competed to gather as many as possible. Though it wasn't easy, each chip had to be carefully peeled, scraped, pounded, and dried. Some were too big to burn, so kids would take turns kicking them until they were small enough to carry. Children spent long days hauling baskets of them home. It wasn't easy work. The air grew colder and windier, but there was no other way to keep warm. In the end, they figured out that buffalo chips actually worked well. They burned hot, clean, and with little smell. A strong chip fire could keep a cabin above freezing even when outside was 30 below. But above freezing still meant discomfort. Most families spent entire winters never once feeling fully warm, shivering from November clear through April, fingers numb, bones aching, the cold living inside you like a squatter that wouldn't leave, and yet somehow life went on. The harvest had to be gathered, animals needed tending, children had to be educated, illness couldn't be ignored. Life on the plains demanded constant work, even in the coldest depths of winter. The first frost was the real test. Did your cabin hold out? Did you gather enough fuel? Were your food stores safe from rodents and mold? For newcomers, greenhorns, the first winter was often a nightmare. The Jensen family, for example, came from Philadelphia in 1878. They thought they knew cold. They didn't. Their thin-walled house with big windows bled heat. By January, their food was ruined, and they were boiling leather to eat. Their lives were spared only when a Lakota neighbor showed them how to rebuild, turning their doorway away from the wind, raising windbreaks, and insulating properly. We owe him our lives, Jensen later wrote. Okay, here's one fact I learned while researching the Oregon Trail. Along the way, pioneers would stop at these forts. Forts like Fort Laramie, which was a U.S. Army post established in 1840 at the intersection of modern-day I-25 and Highway 26, just north of the North Platte River in Nebraska. Here they could resupply, get new oxen or whatever, and also learn how to survive the winter on the Great Plains. Because if you didn't know, this part of the country can get pretty cold, and a lot of pioneers headed out too late in the season to make it to Oregon or Washington Territory before the snow flew. So they'd spend the winter there, and those who did freeze to death or get eaten by wolves were the ones humble enough to learn from the natives how to live off the land and, stay warm. See, native people had lived with these winters for centuries, and their knowledge often spelled the difference between life and death. So let's talk about that. Let us talk about what those forts were like and how people lived there and some of the things that they did to survive the winter. Successful families, whether they were native or immigrant, adapted everything: homes, food, clothing, routines, all carefully attuned to last until spring. Take the Williams family of Nebraska in 1875. They built a sod house, walls cut from prairie turf, 3 feet thick, roof thatched with prairie grasses. Ugly, yes, damp, often, but those walls held steady at 50 degrees, even when outside was 30 below. They built with the sun in mind, doors facing south. They dug earth berms against the walls to block the wind. Inside, quilts partitioned rooms so smaller spaces could hold heat. Their barn connected directly to their living quarters, so the cows and horses helped warm the house through the shared wall. On bitter nights, even the chickens were carried inside to roost by the bed. Not pleasant, Mary Williams admitted, but it kept us alive. When the soil was too hard to dig, the Williams family, along with other settlers and soldiers at the fort, turned to the buffalo, or bison, as their main source of meat. They hunted them, they dried the meat, they made pemmican out of it, which is a mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries. It lasts a long time and it's high in protein and calories, perfect for surviving the winter. They also foraged for berries, roots, and herbs, and they grew hardy vegetables like potatoes and kale. These were all good sources of vitamins and also helped prevent scurvy. Even clothing and personal hygiene changed. People wore multiple layers of heavy wool, not just for warmth, but the oils from their skin would help keep the wool from chafing. Everyone bathed less frequently. This wasn't really a dirt bath era. People still bathed, just not as often. The water would be heated over the fire. And at the fort, there was even a communal bathhouse for the soldiers. Routines also changed. At a place like Fort Laramie, most people tried to keep 2 regular hours. Wake up early, do chores, tend the crops if it was the right season, hunt, trade, socialize. Regularity was comforting for the children, and it gave adults a sense of normalcy. Plus, the sun rose and set at roughly the same times every day. And since there weren't clocks, that was important. But perhaps most important to surviving the winter on the frontier was community. People looked out for one another. At the forts, there were community kitchens and work details. There were dances and quilting bees and Sunday schools. They celebrated holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving. They put on plays and rodeos. And yes, they told ghost stories around the fireplace, too. All of this helped remind people of the world they'd left behind and eased their longing for home. For many, it was their only way to endure the long months of winter on the frontier. Thanks for watching.